He barely touched the shopping cart. Just a gentle nudge as he reached for the milk carton on the top shelf. But the young man saw it differently. Saw an opportunity. Saw weakness. "Watch where you're going, old man." The voice cut through the grocery store aisle like a blade. Sharp, aggressive, designed to humiliate. The elderly gentleman turned slowly, his weathered hands still gripping the cart handle. His back was bent from decades of hard labor, his steps measured and careful. At 82, every movement required intention. "I'm sorry, son. Didn't mean any trouble." But sorry wasn't enough. Not for this predator who'd spotted easy prey. "Sorry. Doesn't cut it, Grandpa. Maybe you should stay home if you can't handle a simple trip to the store." The young man stepped closer, his chest puffed out, feeding off the attention of other shoppers who were now watching. Some pulled out phones, others looked away. Nobody stepped forward. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his worn baseball cap. The fabric was faded, the brim shaped by countless years of wear. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the small pin attached to the side, might have read the letters embroidered above the visor. But nobody was looking at an old man's hat. They were watching a spectacle. "Listen here, you piece of—" The young aggressor raised his voice, drawing more attention. This was his moment, his stage. The elderly man simply nodded and began to turn away. That's when the push came. Not hard enough to seriously injure, but calculated, designed to send a message. The old man stumbled, his arthritic knees buckling as he caught himself against the dairy case. The store fell silent except for the hum of refrigeration units. "Stay down, old-timer. Maybe next time you'll remember your place." But as the old man slowly straightened himself, something changed in his posture. His spine found strength that hadn't been there moments before. His shoulders squared in a way that spoke of muscle memory deeper than bone. He turned to face his attacker with eyes that had seen things this young man couldn't imagine. That wasn't just any old man. If you believe that age doesn't diminish the courage that once defended this nation, hit that like button right now. Because some battles are fought in grocery store aisles, and some warriors never stop fighting for what's right. Subscribe and ring that bell, because this story is about to show you why respect isn't just given. It's earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The young man was still smirking when he noticed the change, the way the old man's stance shifted, the way his breathing steadied, the way his eyes went from apologetic to something else entirely. "Son," the old man said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made several shoppers step closer to hear. "I've been pushed around by much scarier things than you." The grocery store lighting seemed to catch something on the old man's cap that hadn't been visible before. A small bronze star, a purple ribbon barely visible unless you knew what to look for. "Yeah, right, Grandpa. What are you gonna do? Call the cops?" But the old man wasn't looking at his tormentor anymore. He was looking past him to where a middle-aged woman had pulled out her phone. Not to record the confrontation like the others, but to make a call. "Mrs. Patterson," she said into the phone. "It's Sarah from Miller's Market. You need to get down here, now. Someone just put their hands on Sergeant Major Williams." The name hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Sergeant Major Williams. Not just another elderly shopper struggling with his weekly groceries. Not just another forgotten face in a world that had moved on without him. This was a man who had earned that title through 28 years of military service. A man who had parachuted into Normandy on D-Day when he was barely 18. Who had fought through the hedgerows of France and the bitter cold of the Battle of the Bulge. Who had come home to a country that celebrated victory but quickly forgot its veterans. The young aggressor's smirk faltered as other shoppers began to murmur. Words like Sergeant Major and D-Day rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. "I don't care what he was," the young man said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "That was like 80 years ago, or whatever, 80 years ago." As if time could diminish what this man had given. As if decades could erase the nights he'd spent in foxholes, listening to German artillery tear through the French countryside. As if age could make him less than the teenager who had lied about his birthday to enlist after Pearl Harbor because his country needed him. But here's what that young man didn't understand. What none of them understood as they stood in that fluorescent lit aisle surrounded by everyday groceries and mundane concerns. Heroes don't expire, courage doesn't have a shelf life, and some debts can never be repaid, only honored. The automatic doors at the front of the store chimed as they opened. Mrs. Patterson, all 5 feet 2 inches of her, walked through with the purpose of a woman who had spent 40 years as a military wife. Behind her came 3 other people, then 5, then more. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when someone disrespects a man who once stood between democracy and darkness. Sergeant Major Williams watched them approach and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not pity, not sympathy, but recognition, respect, the acknowledgement that what he had done mattered. The young man looked around nervously as the crowd grew. These weren't just random shoppers anymore. These were people with purpose, people who understood that some things are sacred. Look, I don't want any trouble, he started to say. But Mrs. Patterson was already speaking, her voice carrying clearly through the store. Tommy Williams didn't ask for trouble in June of 1944 either, but he went anyway. For you, for all of us. She moved to stand beside the sergeant major, her hand gently touching his arm. This man jumped out of a perfectly good airplane over Nazi-occupied France when he was younger than you are now. He crawled through mud and blood and watched his friends die so that you could have the freedom to shop in this store without fear. Others began to speak up, veterans from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, their wives, their children, their neighbors, people who understood that freedom isn't free and respect isn't optional. The young aggressor found himself surrounded not by an angry mob, but by something more powerful, a community that remembered, that honored, that refused to let service be forgotten or disrespected. I didn't know, he stammered. That's the problem, said an older woman whose own husband had served in Korea. You didn't know because you never bothered to learn. You saw an old man instead of an American hero. The sergeant major raised his hand, a gesture that immediately quieted the growing crowd. The authority in that simple movement was unmistakable. This was a man accustomed to command, even at 82. That's enough, he said quietly. The boy made a mistake. We all make mistakes. He looked directly at his young attacker, and for the first time, the kid really saw him. Saw the scars on his hands from shrapnel. Saw the way he favored his left leg where a German bullet had found its mark in a Belgian forest. Saw the quiet dignity of a man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. Son, I don't need an apology, but I need you to understand something. Every day you wake up free, every choice you make without fear, every word you speak without persecution, that's paid for by blood. Sometimes that blood came from kids not much older than you, who never got the chance to grow old and shop for groceries on a Tuesday afternoon. The store was dead silent now. Even the background music seemed to have stopped. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you because someone needs to remember. Someone needs to carry it forward. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see an old man struggling with his shopping cart, you'll remember that heroes come in all shapes and ages, and sometimes they're standing right in front of you. The young man's eyes filled with tears he didn't expect. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm really, really sorry. Sergeant Major Williams extended his weathered hand. Apology accepted, son. Now, how about you help me reach that milk on the top shelf? These old bones aren't what they used to be. As the two men, separated by generations but connected by this moment of understanding, completed the simple task of grocery shopping together, something beautiful happened in that ordinary store on that ordinary Tuesday. People began to talk. Really talk. About service and sacrifice. About the men and women who had worn the uniform. About the debt that could never be fully repaid, but should never be forgotten. Mrs. Patterson organized an impromptu gathering right there in the store. Veterans shared stories. Young people listened with newfound respect. Children learned names and dates that had been just words in history books. The sergeant major found himself surrounded not by pity, but by genuine interest. People wanted to know about D-Day, about the friends he'd lost, about what it felt like to serve. For the first time in years, his stories had an audience that cared. The young man who had started all this, his name was Jake, they learned, stayed the longest. Asked the most questions, listened the hardest. "What made you do it?" Jake asked as the crowd began to thin. "What made you willing to die for people you'd never met?" The sergeant major considered the question carefully. "Son, you don't do it for people you've never met. You do it for the idea that people should be free to meet each other, to disagree, to make mistakes, to grow, to become better than they were yesterday." He looked around the grocery store, at the ordinary people living ordinary lives in extraordinary freedom. Every person in this store tonight, they're why we served. Not because they're perfect, but because they're human, and humans deserve the chance to be their best selves, even when they start out being their worst. Jake nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. "I want to do something," he said, "to make up for what I did, to honor what you've done." The sergeant major smiled, the first real smile he'd worn in months. "Son, you want to honor me? Honor all of us? Then remember this feeling. Remember that every person you meet might be carrying a story you can't imagine. Treat people with the respect you'd want for your own grandfather, your own father, your own future self." As the store finally began to empty, Jake helped Sergeant Major Williams load his groceries into his car. They exchanged phone numbers, made plans to meet again. Would you tell me more stories sometime?" Jake asked. "About the war? About your service?" "I'd be honored to, son. I'd be honored to." 3 weeks later, Jake started volunteering at the local VA hospital. He spent his weekends listening to veterans' stories, helping with activities, learning about sacrifice from men and women who had given everything for their country. He organized a program at his college called Living History, where students could meet with local veterans and record their stories. The program grew, spread to other schools, became a movement. The grocery store incident, as it came to be known, sparked something larger in the community. A Veterans Recognition Day was established. A memorial garden was planted. Young people began to see elderly veterans not as burdens or relics, but as links to the history that shaped their freedom. Sergeant Major Williams became something of a local celebrity, but he handled it with the same quiet dignity he'd shown that day in the store. He spoke at schools, participated in ceremonies, shared his stories with anyone who wanted to listen. But his favorite moments were still the quiet ones. The Tuesday afternoon phone calls from Jake, now in his senior year, and planning to join the military after graduation, the letters from other young people who had heard his story and been inspired to serve their communities. The grocery store manager, inspired by what he'd witnessed, started a program offering discounts to veterans and active military. Other businesses followed suit. The town began to change, one conversation at a time. 6 months after that confrontation in the grocery store aisle, Sergeant Major Williams was invited to speak at the high school graduation ceremony. As he stood at the podium, looking out at 200 young faces about to embark on their adult lives, he thought about that scared 18-year-old who had jumped into darkness over France so many decades ago. "Your freedom was paid for before you were born," he told them, "by people who believed in tomorrow more than they feared today. You don't owe us your lives, but you owe us your best effort, your commitment to being worthy of the sacrifice that was made for you." In the audience, Jake sat with his family, wearing his new army dress uniform. He had enlisted 3 months earlier, inspired by an old man's quiet courage and dignified response to disrespect. After the ceremony, as families celebrated and took pictures, Jake approached his mentor. "Sergeant Major, I ship out to basic training next week." The old soldier's eyes glistened with pride. "You'll do fine, son. You'll do just fine." "I want you to know something," Jake said. "That day in the store, that was the most important day of my life. Not because I was humiliated, but because I learned what real strength looks like." They embraced. These two men separated by decades but united by respect, understanding, and the continuous thread of service that connects one generation to the next. As Jake walked away to rejoin his family, Sergeant Major Williams stood alone for a moment in the school parking lot. The sun was setting over the small town he'd called home for 40 years. Somewhere, in houses across America, other veterans were sitting down to dinner, watching television, living quiet lives that bore no resemblance to the heroes they had once been. But that was okay. Heroes don't need recognition to remain heroic. They just need to be remembered, honored, respected. And sometimes in grocery store aisles and high school graduations and everyday moments of connection, they are. The next morning, Sergeant Major Williams returned to Miller's Market for his weekly shopping. As he walked through the automatic doors, several people nodded respectfully. A young mother pointed him out to her children and whispered, "Something about the hero who helped that young man learn respect." He smiled and continued to the dairy aisle, where he reached easily for a carton of milk on the middle shelf. The store manager had rearranged the display after learning about the arthritis in the sergeant major's shoulders. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest meaning. Sometimes respect is as simple as putting the milk where everyone can reach it. Sometimes heroes are just old men who remember what it means to serve, and young men who learn what it means to honor that service. As he finished his shopping and headed to the checkout line, Sergeant Major Williams noticed a new sign by the register. "This store proudly honors our veterans. Thank you for your service." The teenage cashier, who had heard the story from his manager, looked up as he scanned the groceries. "Thank you for your service, sir. Thank you for remembering, son. That means everything." And in that simple exchange, in that moment of recognition between generations, the true victory was won. Not on a battlefield in France, not in a confrontation over grocery carts, but in the daily choice to see each other's humanity and honor the sacrifices that make freedom possible. The receipt printed with a soft mechanical whir. The automatic doors opened with their familiar chime, and an 82-year-old hero walked into the afternoon sunshine, carrying his groceries and the knowledge that his service, all of their service, would be remembered, because that's what heroes do. They serve, they sacrifice, they remember, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, they help us remember too. The next time you see an elderly person struggling, remember this story. Remember that heroes walk among us every day, wearing the wrinkles of age but carrying the strength of service. Comment below with the word respect if you believe our veterans deserve recognition every day, not just on holidays, because dignity doesn't diminish with age and honor never expires.